Welcome, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of the conference. Sorry, I'm saying good day because I'm in South Africa. I hope you're doing good, and thank you so much for joining us. So, welcome to day 3 of this conference. I am not alone. I'm with a wonderful and brilliant panel that I've been working with on this project called Responsible Data and Monitoring and Evaluation in African Context. My name is Talita Tlaka, and I'm a Monitoring and Evaluation Communications Officer at the Center for Learning on Evaluation and Results, otherwise known as CLEAA in Anglophone Africa. So I'm going to introduce you in a bit, our panelists, but I just want to introduce you to the session. I'm sure you know what session you're in, but this is on defining responsibility in data management and sharing. And what we are finding is that MD practitioners are confronted with, big volumes of big data and digital data and the data laws and the responsibilities that goes with that. And in addressing these issues, my panel and I, and there's other individuals who are not on the call today, but the panel, CLEAA and Meltec came together and they put together this responsible data guide for MD practitioners in Africa. And it's a 2-part guide. And the first part really talks about the overview of data governance in South Africa, in Africa, not in South Africa. And the second one is more on responsible data management in MD for the African context, of course, as I've been saying. So we've been working together for a bit over a year on this, and finally in December, we were able to finally produce this guide, which we are happy to share with you today. And I'm sure you would have seen it on the conference session page. If you haven't, you can check it out. But let me go ahead and introduce to you our panel today. So I have with me Rachel Sibande, who's a Senior Director, Country Outreach at Digital Impact Alliance, otherwise known as DAL, who are a proud partner of this very conference. And Rachel has over 15 years experience in managing development projects in technology, big data, public health, agriculture, election monitoring, democracy, governance, business development and entrepreneurship. She has managed projects deployment in various African countries, as well as establishing Malawi's first innovative hub, an incubator called M-Hub. The hub is an incubator for innovators and emerging entrepreneurs and provides investment, readiness, support, and finances. Rachel is a Google Scholar and Next Einstein Ambassador, a Yali alumni, and has been listed twice on Forbes. And then we have Mark Ibura, who's a technical advisor at GIZ Fair Forward. Mark has extensive experience heading end-to-end digital implementations for bilateral and multilateral development agencies, government ministries, and private foundations. With more than a decade of experience, predominantly in Eastern Southern Africa, Mark has implemented and managed large-scale M&E platforms, assessed scalable technical tools, and designed comprehensive data models and enterprise software tools to visualize and manage data. He has also undertaken work in understanding the open contracting and open data landscape in West and East Africa. And as a practitioner, Mark is therefore possessing first-hand experience on data security and data privacy demands and concerns when data has to be collected and processed across various sectors. So we lastly on the panel have with us Desiree Jason, who's a senior manager in the South African national government at the National Department of Social Development, responsible for monitoring and evaluation of policies and programs. Des has completed her master's in Pretoria University and holds a postgrad diploma in monitoring and evaluation at Stellenbosch University, and currently serves on the South African Monitoring and Evaluation Association as a board member. Over the years, Des has acquired skills in senior management, policy development, strategic planning, program management, monitoring and evaluation, designing business processes, stakeholder management, and designing and developing capacity building interventions. And that's our panel for today. Welcome, colleagues. Thank you. So let's go ahead and get right into it. And Des, I have my first question to you, but before I do that, I just want to share with our audience today our framework. This is the Responsible Data Monitoring and Evaluation Framework, and our guys are really on. They were built on this framework. So if you can just give me a moment, we will be having more of a discussion, but I need to share this with you. Okay, go ahead, Des.
All right, thanks a lot for that. But I think firstly, I would like to say that governments all over the world, we were faced with the COVID-19 pandemic, and most governments realized the importance of data and big data sets to be able to manage the pandemic. So I'm going to speak about the framework and do a little bit of comparison between the data life cycle as well as the monitoring and evaluation cycle. I will start off firstly with most programs and in most frameworks, they start off with the designing and the planning phase. And it's about, especially if we look at the data life cycle as the integration of data protection into your program, what data needs to be collected. I think that's the questions that would be asked: how, when, by who will this data be collected, from whom, and in what format, meaning how. So focusing on the planning and budgeting for the management of data roles and responsibilities and identifying laws. For example, in South Africa, we have recently introduced the POPI Act, which looks at the protection of personal information. So during this time, it's also about how do you ensure that there is consensus and putting in place the data collection processes and agreements. For example, your various memorandums of agreements, your MOUs, etc. Then the next phase is about the collection of the data, and then how will this data be collected, and also what tools will be utilized. And also here you can have a document, sort of a standard operating procedure, where you will outline how the data processes will flow. The next area, it's about the storage of data to ensure that when the data is stored physically or digitally, that you are, the aspect also what Mark will speak about, data security is very key during this phase. Then the next part is about cleaning and analyzing data. And also here it's about, which is very important, it's about the disaggregation of data to be able to utilize it and have information and evidence at hand. So your disaggregation can be around gender, can be around age, can be around geographical location, and also then the documentation process. Then the sharing of data is very critical, especially in the area that I work in the South African government context. We are looking at how do we share big data sets to improve services, especially to poor and vulnerable communities. Then it's also the communication of data, and how will the data be communicated, and also in what platforms. Will it be visually, for example, will you be able to draw inferences from it, etc. And then lastly, it's to retain, maintain, and also destroy data, especially with us in government, when we have service providers and we're doing projects and we've collected data. One key area is to say that how we outline to service providers how the data should be stored and how the data then should be destroyed. Thanks a lot, Tamika.
Great, thank you so much for that, Des. And what has been the biggest changes in the last 5 years in your work in terms of data sharing and management in the government context?
Okay, thanks. For us was when the South African government introduced the data governance legislation, which is titled the Protection of Personal Information, and the acronym is normally known as POPIA. And this was put in place to ensure data privacy and data protection laws. And this is mandated to the Office of the Information Regulator, which sits in the Department of Justice. So I think also by where this office is seated, it also then carried a bit of weight and importance. And the purpose of the Act was to protect personal information throughout the data life cycle, which was presented and I spoke to, and how data is collected, processed, stored, and how it is shared. So with the South African government, we have started utilizing large data sets to ensure that poor and vulnerable households have access to economic support. For example, we also saw it with the lockdown, where we had to ensure that families do have finances in their households to ensure that they can buy food. And besides that, we also have a very large social security system with about 18 million people receiving social grants. So we do have big data sets, and we normally share these data sets across governments and as well within the NGO space. So we've got a policy in the South African government which reads out as the National Integration of Social Protection Information Systems. And the main aim was to ensure that poor households then have access to economic resources. So we wanted to, when COVID hit, we wanted to do a rapid study for us to be able to say that how do we improve the economic support to these vulnerable families and communities. We then had to apply to the regulator of South Africa to be able to utilize the cell phone numbers because people could not come physically to the various offices. We then had to use digital platforms to reach most of these vulnerable communities. We then had to be able to ask the regulator then that once we want to see how could we improve the effectiveness of the system for the study, we then ensured the regulator that we will not use their personal information like the names, surnames, the identification numbers, and the addresses. And this was the protection of personal information. We then signed a data processing agreement with the service provider that was appointed to ensure that the data will only be used for the purposes of the study, and the data will then be deleted and destroyed on completion. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Des. And I see you have a question, but we'll get to the questions later at the end of our discussion. We are noting the questions, so if you do have questions, please do let us know what your questions are. So Mark, I'll extend the same question to you with regards to more around data management and law regulations.
Thanks, Talitha. So we'll talk about data, and we know what has resulted post 2015 when the SDGs were enacted. Then the data revolution, the advent of big data and technologies that were not there in the era of the MDGs, of the Millennium Development Goals, such as Facebook, social media, proliferation of mobile phones, smartphones, GIS data, and generally open data. So in Africa, probably the open data movement begins probably 2008 moving forward. But then the issues to do with regulating data use and data privacy, they had existed much earlier. It's just that people woke up and realized, post as early as 1998, the UN had conceived issues to do with data privacy, but and most constitutions probably anchored data privacy in terms of your own human rights. And there has been a realization subsequently, post that, yes, data can be used for development, but also data can be abused. So we see post 2018, essentially, when the GDPR come into effect, that a lot of states, also in Africa, I think more than half, rushed to pass one or another kind of data protection law. And these laws essentially, I've had it summarized into two main things. That I have a right to know how my data is being used, but I also have the right to say no, but still participate in active development, especially where government is concerned. So you should not be discriminated against on basis of geography, on basis of gender or age, because you cannot access certain technology, because you need to receive certain services from government. So that is how regulations have come into effect. First, steeped a lot in human rights, specifically the right to privacy. But then data protection has come as a way in which to enforce data privacy, to enforce my rights as an individual to do these two things which I've just shared, and also collectively at times. It would be a fallacy to say data protection does not apply to collective or active use of data that is being collected or being used by entities, by corporations, by government. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I have such an edge to ask you a question, but I'm going to respect time, and if time allows, I'll go back and ask you the question. But I'm going to extend that question again to you, Rachel. What changes have you seen in your line of work in the last 5 years?
Thank you, Talita. So at the Digital Impact Alliance, we are a think, do, replicate tank. And part of what we've been doing in the last 5 years and more is to, first of all, start off with thinking through research around the business models for data sharing. In particular, when we were established, we were tasked to demonstrate the combination of telco data with other data sets to answer some key development questions that governments grapple with. It could be governments wanting to understand where to place new health facilities, where to place new schools, or indeed to understand how populations have been displaced post-natural disasters, just to mention a few. And so we set out to convene partners at a country level. These are inclusive of government, mobile network operators as data holders, but also regulatory authorities and technical partners to analyze these data sets in answering these questions for governments. At this point, we're at a place where we're looking for countries and partners that are willing to replicate some of these data models. But back to your question in terms of some of what we have seen in the last 5 years. So we've seen new kinds of data. As I mentioned, we've been using core detail records, satellite imagery as alternative or complementary data sources to the traditional digital data sets, such as census, which were usually often the only ground truth of data in as regards generating insights on population density. And we've also used core detail records to generate insights on migration patterns of people in the short term, long term, or indeed seasonally. And as you know, this has been an emerging space. We've seen the use of big data, artificial intelligence and machine learning in answering some of those development questions by governments in a much faster, less costly way in enhancing the use of insights for development. However, it's also important to note that these shifts have not entirely taken away the need for collecting secondary data where needed, particularly in cases where certain demographic segments have not been fully represented in these new conventional data sets. For example, we've seen that women, children, and the elderly, in most cases, are not well represented in core detail records from mobile network operators, particularly when you're looking at development country contexts. We've also seen emerging discussions and considerations around issues of inclusion in as regards data use is concerned. We've also seen discussions emerge around issues of biases that come with use of technology and algorithms. As Mark mentioned, issues of data protection, responsible data use have emerged as key levers to drive data sharing and management. And so we have seen tools, policies being developed around the themes of, the legal frameworks at the regulatory level, but also technically we've seen algorithms. And in particular, like in our case, we've been investing in open source technology tools for analyzing mobile network operator data in particular, owing to the gaps that we had seen of a lack of technical tools for analyzing this sort of data. From a monitoring perspective, we've also seen emerging discussions around how can we measure adherence to safe and responsible data use. These are some of the emerging issues that we have seen. And just to also pick up from what Mark was talking about, in particular in the countries where we've been working on these data demonstration models, for example, in Malawi and Sierra Leone, we've also seen that the data demonstration models we're working on, where we're using mobile network operator data, have actually stimulated for these countries to embark on developing their data protection laws. And some of these have actually just come to a close and been enacted into law or are waiting to be enacted into law. So these are some of the emerging themes that we have seen emerge within the space of use of telco data. Finally, I also want to mention that we've seen the emergence of independent audits of some of these systems that are used or the processes that are used for data sharing and data management. And an example in point is OCHA, who have actually audited some of our work and that of others that are working in the data for development space, just to ensure that there's an upholding of safe and responsible data use practices. Thank you, Taita.
Thank you, Rachel. And interesting, and you touched a bit on the partners that you've been involved with your work. And I'm just wondering, all these changes that you're noting to us, what has that meant for partnerships and data sharing?
Yeah, I think one of the key takeaways in terms of what this has meant to partnerships and data sharing is the demand that we are seeing from partners to scale some of these data models. It's more like having shown them the art of the possible of what they could actually use telco data for. They have seen that potential, and now we have seen the demand for them to replicate those models to answer other development questions. For example, in Malawi, our first use case was around where can the government place new health posts? As COVID-19 struck, the government saw the need and the potential for that same data model to answer questions around where are potential COVID-19 hotspots if we are to look at how people are moving in the short term or in the long term or indeed seasonally, so that they can respond quicker. Now, as Cyclone Ana, which has hardly hit Mozambique and parts of Malawi as a natural disaster has struck, they are looking into how can they use the same data models for them to understand which populations are being displaced. I think that is one key takeaway as we see governments getting to understand better the potential that exists and the demand for them to replicate. We are hoping that this replication and scaling can not just happen at a country level, but also across other geographies. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel. Mark, I'll move back to you. What does this mean for you, and more so with community data rights? What does this mean?
Yeah, so first of all, is a shift, a recognition in the community being able to also collect its own information or them appreciating the value of data. Of course, data literacy is a component, and maybe we are not able to talk about that today. But realizing that data is an asset, whether to private companies or to government, or even to the community to agitate for some of the things that they would want. But then on the other part, and Rachel did mention a bit of this, we have been dealing with formal statistics, or they are called official statistics, but also the recognition that some of this data that is collected outside of government structures really is also important in monitoring development or contributing to development, at least not to put that companies do it very well than the developing sector, but private sector than the developing sector. But that appreciation that we can use data to kind of serve communities with products and services that add value and that can be afforded, that are meaningful and change lives. So first is that recognition that there is that component. I think the other part is the power dynamic from within and from the without. So how do we deal with trust, number one, okay? And then number two, how do we deal with the issue of looking at the values and you know, how do we control, for example, from within, when we talk about us being able to really be sure that we are safe when it comes to data from our community, and manage the power dynamic, because people who have power, whether they are researchers, whether it's government, whether it's the media, they have power. And us having a voice to be able to control whatever narratives can be put out there about us as communities. So that is one aspect. So that is within, but without also whether we are looking at these relationships, whether they are government to government or north to south, and that ability then to realize that when we are talking about data, then inherently those who have data have inherently some power and some control, and that needs to be managed. Hence, it goes back to the issues of trust and breeding trust. Yes, thank you.
Awesome, thank you, Mark. Back to you, Des. Tell us a bit more about what this looks like, the data partnership and data sharing in governments. How does this look in government?
Thanks, Rita. It's a new area for us in South Africa, where we have realized the importance of data, especially to bring about better well-being in communities. So with the National Integrated Social Protection Information System, which is one data sharing platform that we are enhancing in government, the South African government has taken it quite seriously, and it's one of the key priority areas, and it's a target on every minister's performance agreement. So we've started quite small. We started small in the sense that we started looking at sharing data between the Department of Social Development and the Department of Basic Education, to be able to assess what is the educational performance of children receiving social grants or cash transfers in their households, and also to see how it can be utilized to get them out of intergenerational poverty and ensure that they then can access institutions of higher learning. So from that building block, we then also started to move sharing the data within the Department of Health. But there is a bit of challenges around the privacy of information of people. But we are broadening it in terms of sharing it. We've got an indigent register, which is a register of people who are given water, a certain amount of water supply and electricity. So it's called an indigent register. So we are sharing that with other government departments to ensure then how do those households then also receive better services. When we were struck with COVID, we then also could utilize that and share that data to ensure that there is some cash transfers into households, and also just to improve food security aspects and utilize the data that we had. So we've started small, and there is an approach for it to grow much larger. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Desiree. And I did mention earlier that we've been working on this responsible data and monitoring and evaluation. And I want to ask you, Des, having been part of this project, everyone who's on this call, by the way, has been part of this project, and my panel has been part of this project for a year and a couple of months now, and we've just finally published it if you have missed it earlier on in the conversation. But I want to just find out, like, what's so important about this document? If you were to tell our participants today, what's so important and what can they take away from this document?
Sorry, Talita, I missed you. Which document?
Oh, the responsible data and monitoring evaluation guides.
Oh, all right. From my side, it's that. Can I make reference then to the space where I am working?
Of course, yes.
That will be more useful then also, and for me better to speak from a space that I understand. So from our side was that, especially if one looks at the Personal Information Act, we within government, it was then also the very first time when this was enacted that we had to then ask permission from the Office of Justice to be able to utilize information, because prior to that, we would use personal information of beneficiaries, and there was no guidelines how to utilize it, where to store the information, to ask for permission. And for the very first time, we then now had to speak to the Office of the Information Regulator to adhere to the POPI Act. And it was a first for us, and an area that we are still grappling with, but in terms of it is beneficial for everybody to protect personal information of beneficiaries. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Des. Rachel, any thoughts around what makes this document for you personally and the line of work that you're in? What makes this piece of work that we've been on so important in the space that we are in?
Yeah, so personally, this is a very important document that I would recommend other practitioners to consider taking a look at among the many resources that exist within the data for development space, because it does offer great insight into how to leverage the use of non-traditional data sources, like the example of data from mobile network operators, in a manner that ensures safe and responsible use of the data. As I mentioned earlier, we've seen the emergent use of anonymized data, no personally identifiable information, but also it suggests some ideas on how to do that, best practices. So sharing insights, for example, from mobile network operators rather than sharing raw data itself, advances the use of safe and responsible data sharing mechanisms, because at that point, data is being analyzed at the mobile network operator's firewall within the MNO's environment. There is no personally identifiable information that is leaving the mobile network operator to ensure adherence to safe and responsible data practices. It also does touch on some of the mechanisms within which partners within the data for development space, or those that are intending to use these sort of non-traditional data sources for development or for monitoring, that they could use. So for example, data sharing agreements, it could be data analytics sharing agreements, which are also currently available as public goods, so to say. It does also, highlight the availability of open source tools that advance the use of secure algorithms for data analysis, which is also an issue of contention within the big data space, as we talk about issues of bias, inclusion, but even looking at issues of, how secure these algorithms are. If you do anonymize the data, is it a function that can be reversed? That the data can be, returned to its original form. So there are pointers to some of these open source tools that are available to enhance analysis of mobile network operator data, in particular, considering that globally we're still lacking the inherent data science capacity skills to analyze this sort of volumes of data, but also the veracity that they come with and the frequency with which it is required, particularly in situations where this sort of analysis have to be done in real time. For example, to answer key questions that government have in understanding migration patterns of people in the short term, long term, or indeed seasonally, and how they impact people's livelihood and how governments can serve the people that need the most.
Awesome. Great. Thank you, Rachel. I wish we could go more into that, but the time. Mark, any conclusion on that? What are some of your important key takeouts from the guides?
Yeah, maybe I think to this document, there was besides it being technical and being written by, experts and colleagues who are well-versed, is the underlying issues of trust, the underlying issues of trust and the underlying issues of transparency as many practitioners, because we collect a lot of data. You go to communities, a lot of times we do face people like development partners like USAID, like GSA or the World Bank, and we are going to the communities to collect data to report on MNE, but how do we go about it? And I see there was a question that was asked, I'm trying to tie that into the thing about regulation, and the question was like, there are so many laws, there are so many practices, there are so many documents written in our context in Africa, but also beyond. And I think one of the things, I would tie it down to maybe 4 things that can be useful to guide us. So the first one is collective benefit. So as an MNE practitioner or data for development, and Rachel has touched on that, when you're thinking about where you come from, how you monitor progress, what benefits accrue to the people whom you're collecting data from. Then the other thing also to think about is, do these people have control over their information that they share with you, the authority to control that information. The other thing has to do with responsibility over how the data is used. The principles of do no harm to subjects. It's part of research, basic research methods. We're told not to do any harm, but looking at that. And then the fourth one is ethics, ethical practices. Throughout the data from collection, you do not lie to participants to participate. How do we treat data from children? How do we ensure that we go a step ahead to collect data from those who are marginalized, so that we also program for them? So the question, yes, was really about keeping tabs of the laws, but I think if we look at the issues of trust and the issues of transparency in what we are doing, it doesn't mean every decision you have to share it, but or share everything that you're doing with the people that you're working with. But if they request to know, or if they would want to know, then we want to know how things were arrived at. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. I think we can take the questions that we have, and if you have any more questions, please do type your questions in. We are more than happy. Shadrach had a question, Des, and he did have a comment as well. He said, I really appreciate Des citing data regulations here, considering that national laws governing data privacy, data management, etc. are rapidly changing and can be difficult to fully understand. I'm curious about how organizations stay on top of what their obligations are in specific countries, especially if projects are transboundary or regional. Des, any comment on that?
Thanks for that question. I think from when we enact these national laws, then from the side of government, we are obligated to adhere and implement those policies, guidelines that was brought about with the POPI Act. And what most departments then started to do was to ensure that they then set up in terms of human capacity, because from the side of the regulator, they then started engaging with departments, setting up workshops, also then having representatives that would come to various national departments, and then they filtered it down to the communication in terms of providing some of the skills to provincial level as well as local level. So there was there was a lot of money that was put behind the implementation to ensure that there is adherence to the POPI Act. So within departments, we work very closely with the Office of the Chief Information Officer. So she would work very closely with the M&E, Monitoring and Evaluation Unit, to ensure that with the data that we do have, we then set up guidelines, we then set up, for example, workshops to ensure that when the other departments that are reporting to us then also adhere to that. We then started to develop our MOUs and agreements, and then we'd also ensure that we factor in some of the legislation from then the Office of the Regulator. They then also avail themselves to guide us during this transitional period. I mean, because, for example, I can also cite that we needed then to adapt our standard operating procedures to ensure that we effectively adhere to the data governance rules, to ensure that there is data privacy, that we adhere to data protection, and the entire monitoring and evaluation chain and research chain when we are utilizing data of beneficiaries. So there was a lot of, in terms of human capital investment in it, as well as from the legal aspect, that we had to work much closer with each other. Thanks.
Thanks, Desiree. And I hope that question was answered, Shadrach. Rachel, there's a question here from Sudan, and she's asking, any thought about gender data gap?
Yeah, so in terms of gender, like I had mentioned earlier, it's very clear that when we start using code detail records, particularly in developing country contexts, you find that women, children, the elderly, and generally poor populations are underrepresented in code detail records. And so that calls for, first of all, a declaration or indeed accepting the fact that not all demographic populations are represented in that particular data set. And it brings in the concept of complementing with secondary data. So by using telco data as a proxy for population density or migration patterns of people, it does not necessarily mean that it is a smash bullet train. There is always need to complement with secondary data sets in this sort of sense, in particular where certain demographic segments, like when you're looking at data from a gender lens, is not fully representative. So we've always complemented with secondary data, for example, census data, or indeed other demographic data sets that exist within the national statistics to highlight issues such as gender. I see another question from me, Talita. Can I just tackle it?
Sure, please.
Yeah, so I think it's Reham Bashir from CRS asking on the tools that we use for analyzing CDR data. And then he also asked about how we actually use CDR data so the question reads, how can you use the data or CDR data from mobile data network in matter of beneficiary migration and livelihood? Okay, so I'll try and make sense of it. So first of all, in terms of the tools that we use, we invested in open source tools, which you can find. We invested in entities like Flowminder. You can go to flowminder.org. They've built an open source platform called FlowKit, which is what we've deployed, for example, in countries like Mozambique to analyze telco data, to inform insights for disaster management response. We also invested in OPAL. You can go to datapoopalliance.org. And if you want to look at some of the tools that have been used in analyzing telco data, or indeed tools that can help you to put together data for development models or initiatives, you can go to our website, digitalimpactalliance.org. But to finally, to respond to the question on the how CDR data informs migration. So every time somebody makes a phone call or they receive an SMS, they are probably connected to a tower that is probably within 10-kilometer radius of where they are. And that in itself generates a record at the telco, which includes the location of the tower. Now, when they move to, let's say, another location, whether it's home or a market or a hospital or wherever they apply their trade, that also is represented in the telco data records each time a transaction is done on that particular phone call, SMS, you name it. And so when you anonymize the personal identifiable information within those records, which is the phone number, you can be able to aggregate and analyze that data with a particular focus on the location field, on the location data, to generate insights on the population density by understanding home locations. This is data that we analyze normally from a 3-year span. So it's very large volume data. And then you can also generate insights on how people are moving from one place to another in the short term, long term, but also seasonally. So Reham, I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
I think Reham also wanted to know what HLR is.
Was that for me?
Oh, okay. I see Mark also wanted to take it. So that's, oh, there we go. Home location register. Mark, you wanted to say something?
No. Yes. This is also with regards to gender data. Rachel already touched on it in as much as complementary sources of data. So there's that. There's also citizen-generated data. There's also thinking about being deliberate around collecting information that can speak to some of these issues purposively. Things like unpaid care work, where sometimes it's very difficult to quantify that and measure that and collect that information. So it requires a deliberateness and an investment in programming and in design of programs, where we say that either we need to collect this data, we want to understand, like even when you're talking about poverty, like the multidimensional aspects of it and how they bear on the households. Who's the primary caregiver and what kind of tasks do they do? I've been involved in work where you find that it's older grandmas who are taking care of smaller children because their children have gone to the cities to work. So they go to the market, but they also will be the ones again who do the caregiving, but they are not targeted in terms of any programming either by state or non-state actors. So I think that requires like an intentionality around collecting that data. And we don't obviously leave all that burden to the government, but we also complement that by being deliberate as stakeholders in, what we call the national statistic systems, which includes everyone, to try and fill those gaps so that then we ensure we leave no one behind. I just thought I'd make that comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Des, your hand is up.
Yes, I'd like to add on to what Mark was saying. Within the South African context, we've made a deliberate effort to ensure that we have responsive data, and where there is a great focus to get data, especially gender data, and looking at females and girl children, and then also looking at having data on persons with disabilities, that we can improve services to those persons. And then also the aspect of having much more youth data, because we do have a youth bulge, and we want to then ensure then how do we utilize our youth much more effectively and getting them more into economic spaces, internships. So there is a deliberate effort around gender data, persons with disabilities, and youth. Thanks.
Great. And Mark, I want to go back to you because you mentioned earlier when we talk about data laws and regulations that they've always been there, they've existed. It's just that now people are waking up to them. And why do you think that is? Is it because, of this pressure of the big data economy and things are rapidly changing? What is that? And also, now that we know that these laws exist and that we have a role to play within the space, what does this mean going forward? I mean, with the data, responsible data guidance, the first part of it, we touch on the overview of what that looks like in the African context, right? The different laws that exist in different parts of Africa. But going forward, because we know that some of them may be amended, new ones may come, what responsibility do we need to bear in mind that we need to carry out going forward?
Okay, thanks, Tabitha. So I think one of the things that happened, data rights were entrenched in human rights, but one of the things that happened is technology happened. So when technology happened, then and it was innovative and it has been good, maybe for some of us who came before internet, you had to study with Windows 98, for example, and then now Facebook came and Google came, and writing a paper is much easier. But then part of that is there's a lot of metadata collected. And the surveillance capitalism suddenly comes to the fore that data is being collected. So that has happened. There was also the realization, I think it's Edward Snowden who writes the book Permanent Record. So all of a sudden people are aware that there's this data that is being collected that I do not know about. So GDPR as well comes into effect. It's passed in 2016, but it comes into effect in 2018. And all of a sudden, companies must comply, especially in the North, the traditional companies which supply technology to the rest of the world, especially in Silicon Valley, and to Europe to protect EU citizens. And so with that, then a lot of African countries, there had been work done by the AU on cybersecurity. It was focused towards cybersecurity, but then countries then begin to actually take data protection seriously. So that kind of triggered that awareness, that interest, as well as public interest litigation following some of the cases which were happening in Europe and the US. And then now it's being enforced upon programs. You are a data processor. Whenever you collect a bit of data to do something, and I think that is then demanding that accountability, not that I expect, because maybe people will not always do the right thing, but it's being demanded of us by these laws now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see we have 5 minutes left. I noticed earlier we had a hand from Goodwin, but I no longer see it. If you still have that question, Goodwin, go ahead and ask. And if not, I'm just going to ask Rachel, do you have any thoughts on what Mark has just shared? Oh, there we go. There's the hand, and then we can go back to you, Rachel. Goodwin? Are you able to type in your question, Goodwin? And then maybe we can, Rachel, maybe you can share your thoughts while we wait for Goodwin's question.
Yeah, I think from where I stand, just as a parting shot, and the key takeaway is to say, I mean, data has a lot of potential. Some have said it is the new oil, it is the new currency to generate intelligent insights for both the public and the private sector. It is very important to ensure that as we use data for social good, for public good, we must adhere to the concept of doing no harm. The benefits of using data should outweigh the potential harm that the use of data could cause. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel. I don't know if we have any more questions. I was hoping that Goodwin would come. Okay, great. Yeah, I was hoping that Goodwin will come in and just give us his thoughts or any questions that he had, but I don't know. I think he's off the call or something. But thank you so much to the panel. We do have 3 minutes left. So I don't know if you have any last words that you want to share, anything that maybe I didn't get a chance to ask and it's burning in you. I'm getting a lot of thank you.
Just to encourage also our panel, our attendants today to go check out the framework and look at it and share with your friend to share with the next person. Thank you.
Great, absolutely. We do encourage that you do check them out. They are on the conference page of this session. Like I mentioned earlier on, this is a two-part data governance and responsible data, which has like really cool practical tip sheets on how to go about, you know, being responsible with your data as you're going along, as you're collecting your data. So thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you soon. We hope to see you in one of our official launch of the responsible data and monitoring and evaluation. So if you do follow us, you will then know when we will officially be launching it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Bye.
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 Bye. Thanks, Talita.
Bye. See you guys
Bye.
soon.
Bye.
Bye.